The journey from the brutalized, bombed-out ports of North Africa and Europe was, for the captured Axis soldier, an exercise in exhaustion and dread. They came across the Atlantic, packed into the holds of converted Liberty ships and aging transports. Vessels that pitched violently through waters still thick with the menace of U-boats. U-boats they themselves had often commanded or sought to supply. The air below deck was a suffocating mix of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and saltwater spray. They were the remnants of Rommel's Africa Corps, men hardened by the desert sun, or the beleaguered infantry from Sicily and Salerno. Soldiers who had watched the very foundations of their world crumble under the relentless weight of Allied materiel. As the ships finally nudged against the piers of Hampton Roads or New York, the soldiers, clad in dusty, patched uniforms, carried one profound certainty. They were stepping into the heart of the enemy, and the enemy owed them nothing but contempt and punishment. Their minds were filled with the vivid, often distorted, propaganda that had sustained them through years of conflict. A vision of America as a ruthless, efficiency-obsessed machine, certainly victorious, but surely strained by the costs of global war, rationing, and internal strife. They anticipated barbed wire fences enclosing barren, windswept fields, meager, watery rations, and the chilling, impersonal cruelty of triumphant captors. What awaited them, however, was a reality so spectacularly contradictory to their expectations that it often induced a form of collective sensory disorientation. The sheer shock of the encounter, the scale, the casual abundance, the lack of visceral hatred began immediately upon disembarking, but crystallized irreversibly in the mess halls of the newly established prisoner of war camps that stretched from the swamps of Louisiana to the high deserts of Arizona. The first, and arguably the most psychologically impactful surprise waiting for the exhausted columns of Axis POWs in America was the overwhelming, almost obscene display of American abundance. Particularly in the realm of food. These were men who had lived under strict wartime rationing for years. They knew the taste of ersatz coffee, the gray density of rye bread stretched with fillers, the scarcity of any animal protein that was not salted or canned indefinitely. They had watched their own families grow thinner while waiting in queues for butter or sugar. When they were finally marched into the dining halls, often vast, prefabricated wooden structures, smelling faintly of new lumber and disinfectant, they encountered a sensory spectacle that cinema could barely replicate. The tables were not set with tin plates containing thin gruel, as they might have expected from Russian or even British internment descriptions. Instead, the surfaces gleamed under institutional lighting, piled high with food items they hadn't seen in bulk since the late 1930s. The calorific deluge began with the centerpiece, meat. Not the thin, gristly scrapings they were used to, but fatty cuts of beef and pork, often roasted, smoking slightly, served in portions that seemed reckless. They watched, dumbfounded, as American staff slopped generous ladlefuls of mashed potatoes, rich with butter, onto trays. There were mounds of pure, refined white sugar shimmering under the lights, available for coffee or dessert. Sugar that had been an extreme, almost mythical luxury in Germany and Italy. The beverage situation alone was revelatory. Alongside towering pitchers of whole milk, a sight associated only with children and the ill back home, sat endless ranks of percolators, hissing and bubbling, brewing fresh coffee. This was not the thin, bitter, acorn-based brew that passed for coffee in Europe. This was potent, aromatic, deep brown coffee, often served with cream. For men who had spent years substituting roasted grain and chicory, the aroma of real coffee was intoxicating, a symbol of untouched, almost defiant luxury. The sheer quantity of the food provided was calculated to meet the nutritional requirements of active duty soldiers, as mandated by the Geneva Conventions, which the United States strictly adhered to. This meant that the diet was often significantly richer and more varied than that of the average American civilian undergoing rationing, and certainly superior to the diet of the guards who watched them eat. An anecdote commonly recounted by former POWs involved the bread. German soldiers knew brown bread, heavy and solid. Here they were given soft, white loaves, often baked fresh daily. Some accounts described initial suspicion. The men believed the food must be drugged or poisoned, unable to comprehend that such bounty could exist in a nation supposedly at war. Guards reported seeing emaciated prisoners simply sitting, staring at the heaping trays of fried eggs and bacon during breakfast, unable to move past the cognitive dissonance. The effect of this food on the prisoners was rapid and visible. Within weeks, the sunken cheeks filled out, the pallor of wartime malnutrition faded, and the general demeanor shifted from desperate exhaustion to wary vitality. The abundance did more than restore their physical strength. It served as the first undeniable piece of evidence shattering the narrative that America was a struggling nation fighting a war of necessity. The contrast was too stark. If this was the enemy's deprivation, what did that say about the enemy's strength? The sight of waste, too, was shocking. Leftovers, still ample, still rich, were discarded, an act of almost sacrilegious extravagance to men raised on total mobilization and severe scarcity. The mess hall, therefore, was not merely a place of feeding. It was the primary theater of the psychological war, won not by bullets, but by butter and sugar. Once the initial shock of the dining hall subsided, the prisoners were usually loaded onto trains for transfer to permanent camps, often situated deep inland. This cross-country transit formed the basis of the second profound surprise: the overwhelming scale of American infrastructure and the astonishing magnitude of its economic engine. For men accustomed to the densely packed, highly utilized rail networks of Central Europe, where every yard of track and every factory had been targeted relentlessly by Allied bombers, the journey across America was a revelation of untouched, endless power. The trains themselves were often large, polished, and powerful. The rhythmic, echoing clatter of the wheels against the joints of the rails provided the soundtrack to a cinematic panorama of industrial might. As the POWs looked out through the narrow windows of their boxcars or coaches, they expected to see the familiar signs of a country pushing its resources to the absolute breaking point. Dilapidated factories, rusting equipment, roads cratered by neglect, and widespread evidence of material substitution. Instead, they witnessed a land operating at full, effortless capacity. The journey through the American Midwest and South revealed agricultural fields of a scale utterly unimaginable in the patchwork farming culture of Europe. These were not small, traditional parcels worked by hand or horse. These were oceans of grain, cotton, and vegetables stretching to the horizon, tended by massive, efficient farm machinery. The prisoners watched, mesmerized, as gigantic tractors and polished, complex harvesting equipment devoured the crops.
machines often more technologically advanced than the tanks they had just fought in. The sheer efficiency of this agricultural sector, which was feeding the nation, its allies, and now even its prisoners, bespoke an underlying national wealth that felt inexhaustible. As the trains inevitably passed through the fringes of industrial centers, the sight of factories solidified this impression of dominance. These were not the camouflaged, heavily defended, often half-damaged plants they knew back home. Here, massive, sprawling complexes dedicated to steel, automobiles, and armaments stood open and untroubled. Smokestacks pumped black plumes into the sky with impunity. Freight trains carrying raw materials and finished goods stretched for miles. A continuous flow of logistics that spoke of a deep reserve of energy and manpower. The scale of the oil industry, too, was shocking. The endless fields of derricks nodding rhythmically in places like Oklahoma or Texas seemed to tap into an infinite reserve of fuel. The very resource the Axis powers had sacrificed men and territory to obtain. The infrastructure facilitating this movement was equally pristine. The highways were broad and well-maintained, the bridges sturdy, and the power grids robust. There was a conspicuous, unnerving absence of bomb damage. Where German railroads had been constantly repaired and patched, the American lines hummed along, traversing vast open plains with confidence. This transit, often lasting several days and spanning thousands of miles, shifted the prisoners' understanding of the war's trajectory. From an uncertain battle of attrition to an almost mathematical inevitability, they recognized, looking out across the endless plains and witnessing the casual deployment of such enormous industrial power, that their leaders had fundamentally miscalculated the enemy. A nation that could sustain this level of domestic industrial operation while simultaneously projecting overwhelming force across two global theaters was simply unconquerable. The train ride became a silent, objective education in the true dimensions of American strength. An emotional moment where the realization of defeat moved from abstract loss to concrete, terrifying reality. Once deposited at their final destinations, typically remote locations deep in the American heartland, Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, or the isolated regions of the upper Midwest, the Axis POWs encountered the third major surprise, the atmosphere of the camps themselves, which was often surprisingly lax, governed more by isolation than by intentional rigor. They had anticipated the brutal, militaristic discipline they themselves had been trained to administer, or the severity they had heard recounted from the Eastern Front. Instead, they found camps that were functional but hastily constructed, standardized rough pine barracks standing behind simple lines of barbed wire fencing. Often double-layered, usually with watchtowers, but rarely possessing the imposing permanence of a true military prison complex. The main architectural feature of many of these camps was not the strength of the walls, but the sheer, debilitating emptiness surrounding them. Security was rooted in geography. If a prisoner escaped in the desert heat of Papago Park, Arizona, or the scrubland near Alva, Oklahoma, the vastness itself became the most effective form of imprisonment. The environment was the guard. The personnel responsible for their direct supervision compounded this sense of unexpected normalcy. The American guards were rarely the hardened combat veterans the prisoners expected. The most capable fighting men were, naturally, overseas. The domestic role of camp administration fell to a diverse group, often deemed essential at home or physically unsuitable for active duty abroad.
These included older men, sometimes veterans of World War I, who were recalled to service. The physically restricted, designated 4F.
Or very young, often bored, draftees from neighboring communities. These guards projected a distinctly American, often casual approach to discipline that bewildered the intensely hierarchical and formal European soldiers.
Discipline was enforced, certainly, but it lacked the reflexive, almost religious severity of the German SS or even the regular Wehrmacht structures.
There was little of the shouting, the instantaneous physical punishment, or the constant psychological pressure they had known. Instead, they were often dealing with men who preferred quiet efficiency, or simply profound boredom. Many guards viewed the assignment as a tedious, distant detail. Their primary focus was often simply ticking boxes, ensuring headcount, and keeping the peace between the various factions of prisoners, Nazis versus anti-Nazis, Italians versus Germans. The proximity to civilian life, even in these isolated locations, also softened the regimen. It was not uncommon for guards and prisoners to engage in tentative, low-level interactions, exchanging a casual word about the weather, or even participating in the occasional shared baseball game on a day off. This blurring of rigid lines was alien to the Axis mindset. Furthermore, the Geneva Convention required the United States to allow the prisoners to maintain their internal military structure. This meant that the day-to-day discipline, hierarchy, and morale within the camp were largely self-managed, dictated by the senior captured German officers. The American administration focused on security and logistics, permitting the prisoners to organize their own internal order. A system that often resulted in the strict, ideologically driven soldiers imposing a far harsher regime on their fellow captives than the Americans ever would have. This reliance on the POW's own hierarchy further reduced the need for the American guards to impose constant high-pressure surveillance, leading to a surprisingly relaxed, if monotonous, environment. The real security threat was not the guards' cruelty, but the isolation and the sheer distance from any possible help.
The physical texture of the camps, the dusty, wind-blown yards, the rough-cut timber of the barracks, the endless vista of scrub brush surrounding the wire, was characterized by this profound, unsettling quiet. A stillness that whispered of America's vast, confident indifference.
The fourth element to utterly defy the Axis soldiers' expectations was the widespread opportunity for paid labor, a system that allowed them to earn actual canteen script or wages, offering a vital psychological link back to normalcy and affording them small, unexpected luxuries.
The American home front, drained of manpower by the fighting overseas, desperately needed labor, particularly in agriculture and basic industry. Rather than remaining idle, which the Geneva Conventions allowed, most able-bodied POWs were given the option to work, typically outside the confines of the camp. This was a transformative experience. For the first time in years, the defeated soldiers felt productive. They were bussed out early in the morning, smelling the fresh, damp scent of American soil. Transported in trucks that sometimes mingled them with American farmhands or local workers. They worked primarily in the vast agricultural fields of the South and West, stooping for cotton bolls in Texas fields, harvesting vast rows of potatoes in Maine, or picking delicate fruits in California orchards. The work was physically demanding, often exhausting under the relentless American sun. Many of these men were city dwellers, ill-prepared for the grueling, repetitive toil of farm labor. They learned to feel the raw texture of the cotton against their fingers, the sting of sweat in their eyes, and the burning ache in their backs.
But the labor, ironically, was a form of freedom.
It provided structure, physical challenge, and, crucially, contact with the local environment and the civilian population, albeit supervised contact.
The payment system adhered to the conventions. Enlisted men received 80 cents per day in canteen script, which could be augmented by piece rate wages when working for private contractors.
Officers were not required to work, but received a slightly higher allowance for personal expenses.
That script was the key. It was a tangible representation of value, a substitute for currency that could be spent at the camp canteen. A small, bustling outpost of American commerce.
The canteen offered a range of items that, while mundane to the average American soldier, were symbols of unattainable luxury to the prisoners.
The most sought-after items were cigarettes, American brands like Lucky Strike or Chesterfield. The taste of rich tobacco, a profound contrast to the harsh, recycled wartime product they were used to. They could buy candy bars, rich with chocolate and nuts, small toiletries, and most famously, bottles of Coca-Cola.
The sweet, cold, effervescent liquid that tasted like the very essence of the victorious, consumer-driven culture that had defeated them.
The money also facilitated social hierarchies within the camp. Those who worked were physically healthier and possessed access to these small luxuries, elevating their status over the non-working. Or the ardently ideological Nazis who refused to labor for the enemy.
More profoundly, the act of earning and spending normalized their existence.
They were not merely captives awaiting fate. They were temporary workers, participating in the American economy, however minimally.
The feel of the stiff paper script in their pockets and the taste of the cold soda gave them a small, crucial psychological distance from the identity of the defeated enemy soldier,
allowing them a moment to feel like men again, working for wages in a peaceful, productive environment.
This immersion into American civilian life, even in the fields under guard, was an unanticipated introduction to the economic vitality and material normalcy of the enemy.
The fifth and final surprise offered to the Axis POWs in America, one that often shaped their long-term perception of the conflict and their subsequent lives. It was the comprehensive provision for cultural access, education, and organized recreation.
The American administration viewed the camps not merely as holding facilities,
but for many as sites of potential re-education, a mission particularly aimed at countering the persistent influence of Nazism.
The commitment to intellectual and cultural engagement resulted in the creation of facilities.
These went far beyond the minimum requirements of wartime internment. Libraries were established, often crude affairs, housed in basic wooden structures, yet stocked with a surprising array of literature.
The smell of old paper and fresh ink pervaded these spaces, offering an intellectual sanctuary.
The collections included works by classic German and European authors, Goethe, Schiller, Heine. These were often surprisingly obtained through translation or existing U.S. libraries.
Crucially, they also featured American and translated Allied literature, ranging from Shakespeare to contemporary authors like Hemingway and Steinbeck. For many, this was the first time they were permitted access to uncensored narratives that challenged the rigid dogma of state-controlled culture. The educational opportunities were even more formalized, particularly for non-commissioned officers and officers.
University professors, often enlisted as part of the specialized camp staff, organized lectures and classes.
These covered everything from mathematics and engineering to foreign languages, and significantly, American history, civics, and democratic principles.
These classes offered many prisoners the chance to earn diplomas or vocational training.
This would prove invaluable upon their return to a devastated Europe.
The Americans saw the potential for the prisoners to become a stabilizing, educated, and anti-fascist cohort upon repatriation.
The effect of these intellectual resources was profound. Many younger men,
Having been immersed in the relentless propaganda machine of the Hitler Youth and the Wehrmacht, they found themselves, for the first time, confronting independent, critical thought. They saw the American approach, an emphasis on objective learning and the free exchange of ideas. This was utterly incompatible with the authoritarian structures they had served. The library and the lecture hall became subtle, powerful tools of denazification. Complementing this mental activity was a robust schedule of physical recreation. The camps were designed to maintain morale and physical fitness, leading to the organization of highly structured sports leagues. Soccer, Fußball, was universally popular, with pitches, albeit dusty and rough, meticulously marked out. Baseball was introduced, often with comical but serious attempts by the prisoners to understand the rules of the American pastime. They organized boxing matches, track and field events, and theatrical performances. These activities provided a crucial psychological escape. The dust-covered field, the shared effort of a soccer match under the unforgiving American sun, the sight of teammates laughing over a missed goal. These moments provided a glimpse into a peacetime existence. This felt light years removed from the bloody chaos of the trenches and the political paranoia of the battlefield. The cultural and educational access provided not only refuge and learning, but also a profound, structured sense of normalcy. The defeated soldiers were treated fundamentally not merely as military assets to be warehoused, but as human beings capable of rehabilitation and intellectual growth. This respectful, if pragmatic, treatment provided a final, enduring contrast to the harshness they had expected, and in some cases, the brutality they had witnessed or perpetrated. The experience of the Axis POWs in America between 1943 and 1946 was defined by a constant, unsettling realization that the reality of their internment bore almost no resemblance to their darkest expectations. The shock was not physical pain, but sensory overload and cognitive dissonance. They encountered an enemy whose vast resources allowed it to adhere strictly to international law, whose industrial machine was untouchable, and whose civilian population glimpsed through the wire or across a cotton field. They seemed remarkably unburdened by the conflict that was tearing Europe apart. The mess hall, the train window, the board guard, the canteen script, and the library shelf collectively formed an undeniable testament to the overwhelming success and scale of the American war effort. They arrived anticipating the final harsh chapter of defeat. Instead, they received an intense, unplanned education in the nature of modern industrial power and the surprising complexities of democracy. An education that fundamentally altered the worldview of thousands who would eventually return to help rebuild the ruins of post-war Europe. The quiet shock of American abundance proved ultimately to be a more effective weapon than any bomb.